the new president of the World Bank, relatively new, Ajay Banga, has come out with an idea that on its face might seem obvious, which is it's not enough to try to end extreme poverty, to try to make the lives of people on this planet better, if the planet itself is not livable. And so these words, livable planet, were added to the World Bank's mission. And while that might seem obvious, it was actually also a bit controversial. And we're going to get into today sort of the underlying reasons why, because there are some ideas there in the world that development and climate are at opposite poles, that you have to give up something in terms of short-term benefits around jobs or bread or health services. You have to give something up that people need today on their kitchen table in order to work toward a better climate in the future. And today we are going to talk about that very issue. And I think we're going to see it from the perspective of opportunity, because actually that idea is disproven in many ways by real progress happening in various places around the world. And in fact, there's a report out today that we're going to talk about that gets directly into that issue. So this session is a partnership between DevX and our ongoing climate coverage, including our Climate Plus Summit that's going to be hosted on the sidelines of COP in Dubai in just a couple of weeks, and the World Bank as it prepares for its really critical role at the COP, as the whole world looks at the World Bank Group and says, we need the World Bank Group and its major reform agenda and its new mission to really drive a lot of the climate progress that's required in the world today. So this session, I think, will hopefully distill, for many of you who are joining from all over the world, this moment in time, that we will remember this moment just 2 weeks before the COP, and hopefully start to frame up what is the narrative about the opportunity before us. So I want to welcome to the virtual stage here, Stefan Halagate. Stefan, please join with your video.
Hello.
Nice to see you. And you are joining us from the World Bank Group offices in Washington, D.C. I'm in Washington, D.C. too. We will soon be joined by some other panelists who are all over the world. But I want to begin with you because you're one of the authors of this important new report that was just published. You've spent your career at this intersection of climate and economics. And a lot of times when we think about climate issues, there's a lot of focus on technologies for renewable energy, let's say, or adaptation strategies. And you're coming at this from a different perspective, which is to say, actually, we have a lot of the technologies. We have a lot of strategies that we know work, policies that we know work, but what's holding us back in some cases is the political economy around these issues. And you pointed to in this report a number of places where actually those have been solved too. And so in an era when headlines seem pretty negative around the world, it's hard to get positive. This report is worth reading, and it's just being launched today. So I recommend it to everyone who's listening and watching as an opportunity to see where we can actually go. So Stefan, I just want to begin with you. Frame up for us why you thought we needed, at the end of 2023, as we're close to this COP, why we needed a report on the political economy of climate and development.
Well, first, let me thank you for organizing this event. It's a great opportunity for me and everyone who worked on this report to discuss this topic. And I'm very grateful that you start with a positive question. As you're saying, I mean, we really need it these days, and that's really important because when we started working on the political economy of climate policies, the first thing we did was to look at the climate policies, and we realized that every time one policy is being opposed, is being cancelled at the last moment, or even worse, creates unrest. We see it. We see it in the news. Everybody's talking about it. But all of the policies that just gets implemented and work and deliver results, we don't talk about them too much, right? So I don't know if you knew that we have in the world implemented almost 5,000 climate policies in the last 30 years. I don't know if you know that.
I did not know that.
No, it's in 30 years, and it started in high-income countries. Now we see more and more in low and middle-income countries. In El Salvador, in Egypt, in Indonesia, we had very important reforms of energy subsidies, a really, really difficult and sensitive topics. And we haven't talked about them too much, but you know that in Ecuador, it did not work out because the reform was canceled at the last minute. We all talk about the Gilets jaunes in France when the increase in the carbon tax was canceled. So there is this unbalance And we have this sense that climate policies are always creating opposition, while in the numbers, a lot of them are just successfully implemented. So I think restoring this balance and getting a little bit more of the positive story is really useful.
It's so important, and it's so important for the World Bank Group with your tremendous research capabilities to come out with this kind of information, because you're right. Fuel subsidies are probably the most hot button issue when you think about climate policy. Is the first thing the mind goes to, and you picture the Gilets jaunes, people in the yellow vests, in the streets in Paris, right? You picture this because it's happened in many places, and so I can imagine political leaders around the world, when faced with the opportunity to do something about a fuel subsidy that honestly sends us in the wrong direction on climate. It hurts them from a fiscal standpoint. It robs the country of fiscal space to invest in other things, including in development and health and education, right? But you can see why political leaders would find this scary. It seems reasonable to find it scary. So putting out alternative examples that show actually it has worked in some cases, and here's why, is pretty key. And so I want to just unpack that for a second with you, because I think of places like British Columbia or Kenya, opposite sides of the income spectrum maybe, but places would have had a lot of success when it comes to renewable energy, or the examples you gave around fuel subsidies. What is it about those places or their policies or their leadership? What is it that is kind of the secret formula that other places could learn from when they want to address their climate policies and connect it to the political economy they're dealing with?
Well, so all situations are different, but when you compare cases that worked well and cases where reforms did not make it, you still see big differences. And I think that the key point is not to assume that just because a reform, you just look at the science, you look at the economics, it looks great, it's a good idea. Just with those facts, it will be enough to get the policy implemented. There is always people who will oppose it. There will be always people who are not benefiting from it. Its impacts are always very different across regions, across sectors, across people. And what's really important is to understand that what's key is how people see the reform. There is one example that I find really, really interesting is the gas subsidy reform in El Salvador, because the reform was at the beginning, when it was announced, opposed by the people who in the numbers were to benefit from it the most. And when you look at polls and surveys, it was opposed because people just did not trust the government in being able to implement the reform and to deliver what was supposed to be delivered. And when the reform started to show the results and people could see those benefits, you see that the people supporting the reform more and more, and 2 years later, a majority of the population is supporting it. But at the beginning, it was not the reform design; it was the perception of the reform that was
because trust is essential in the sense that when you're removing one subsidy, it's all about, are you going to redistribute the benefits of that subsidy to the people who need it most, right? And I know your report talks about, in particular, when it comes to fuel subsidy, it's not the poorest of the poor necessarily, because they may be lower consumers of fuel, but it's kind of the lower middle class, which in many of the countries we're talking about represents a very big part of the population and of the voting population. And that lower middle class might feel this in a very acute way because they need transport to get to work, let's say, or cooking fuel. And essentially, by removing the fuel subsidy, the government has to redeploy that subsidy in another way that directly benefits those people. And if you don't feel that, or if you don't believe it, you can see why people would be very concerned that they're losing something and maybe not getting something in return.
Yeah, so that's the most important point. So to understand why the subsidy exists, because they are not there just randomly, right? The energy subsidies exist to help people access energy, and this is important. And we can say the same with water subsidies, agriculture subsidies, and so on. So the key point is to say these tools are just inefficient ways of helping people. And what we want to do is not to stop helping people, we want to help people better. And so the narrative is really important for people to understand this is not taking something away from them, it is just using instruments that will be more efficient so that we get more of the results. So even for agriculture subsidies, for instance, you might decide to deliver the same amount of support to your farmers, just instead of subsidizing the use of more and more fertilizers, you will support the use of climate smart strategies that are better for the environment and better for the farmers. But it's really doing the same thing better. and not just taking something away from people.
Right. And I guess fuel subsidies is one example. We'll talk more in a minute as we were joined by other panelists about labor, because I think that's another big area here, right? It's that the economy overall might benefit from a transition to a more green approach to energy, but you might have winners and losers within that economy. You know, here we're talking about, let's say, lower middle class, which is a huge percentage. It might be half the country or something. But there's also specific interest groups, right? I'm thinking about coal workers in South Africa, for example, right? You might have very specific interest groups that are relatively smaller, but have a lot of political power. And how do you address that? If you're advising a politician, a leader in a country that's worried about these interest groups and trading them one off the other, how do you advise them to go forward?
So I mean, in the book, we have some very concrete recommendations, and it really starts with the governance and the narrative, like to present this change as a positive change, and to make sure it's completely connected with development goals. We're not only trying to fix climate, right? We're trying to get a better life for everyone. So it has to be framed in a positive story. And then there are three things, like sequencing of the policies. You don't start with just imposing a huge price of carbon on everything without having a sequence of interventions to prepare your economy, to create some interest groups that will support more climate action, and to make sure for the people who will be negatively affected, they can prepare and it doesn't like fall on them from one day to the next. Then you have to design your policy to help avoid concentrated impacts. But of course, you were talking about coal miners, and it's difficult to avoid negative impacts on coal miners when you do climate policies. So here you really need complementary action. And in the book, we look at the full toolkit, right? And as you say, it's not always the poorest that are the most vulnerable. It can be just people who just made it and risk being just thrown back into poverty by those policies. So you need a very subtle way of supporting them. Part is social protection. Part is active labor policies, so that you help people get new skill and move to new jobs. And part of it is what we call place-based policies. When you have a community strongly affected, you need to just put everything together, right? It's infrastructure, it's incentives for new businesses to come in, it's reskilling, and so on. And the last part that we discuss in the book is the engagement. Because if you want to design good policies, first you have to listen to people. I mean, they know what they need and they know what obstacles they face. And you need, and we come back to the communication, you need people to understand that this is not against them, right? That there is an objective, which is a positive one, and you have to bring them in. And in the Netherlands, for instance, we compared coal exit in different countries in Europe that happened a few decades ago. In the Netherlands, the coal exit was managed with the unions, with this idea that the goal was to help people transition and not just to shut down the activity in the region.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that you've come out with this book, and the timing is so key, because if there's a critique you hear about the World Bank, it's, well, the World Bank is filled with technocrats who are brilliant, but they don't connect to the real world. And this is so real world, because political leaders are grappling with this every day. They're trying to figure out, how do they take really big shifts in context? Costs of renewable energy have dropped dramatically. The global economy is moving in this clear direction. How do they take that and actually do something with it for their country? And the fact is, if they don't, in many cases, they'll be left behind. It'll be a negative. I got to moderate a session at the World Bank's meetings in Marrakesh about critical minerals. And you can see, Africa, for example, many countries of Africa are well positioned in this transition, but it requires some political leadership, the vision you laid out. It requires a report like this to say, there is a formula. It's not an easy formula, but there's a formula you can follow and actually get there. I want to broaden the discussion. We're going to soon broaden it to everyone. We've got incredible leaders and experts from around the world on this call. And so please, if you have questions, start to put those into the Q&A. But I want to broaden this out and bring our two other panelists into the conversation. I'll ask them to turn on their cameras now. We have Sharon Burrow with us. Hi, Sharon.
Hi
nice
there.
To see you.
Hi, Raj. Thank you for having me as part of this conversation.
Well, it's great to be with you. I know that we have a collection of people watching this who are expert in this space. They probably know the two of you very well, but I'll just quickly say that Sharon, you've been a leader in labor movements around the world. You were the General Secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation based in Australia, that's where you are now, and you used to head up the labor unions there. So you understand the labor movement, you understand where labor fits in, and it's such a key part of this conversation. So we're thrilled to have you in this, and you now are a consultant with Just Transition Solutions. So you're very much focused on exactly what we are here talking about. How do we make the climate transition happen in a way that brings justice to the people who deserve it most in our societies around the world? And Arunabha, you lead one of the world's prominent think tanks on these issues based in New Delhi. It's known as the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. So you are focused on and thinking about these issues every single day. So it is fantastic to have the two of you here. Maybe I can just start with you, Sharon. I brought up the issue of winners and losers, and often it feels like it is labor, and it is labor in specific sectors, people who are connected to, say, coal mining or fossil fuel industries, or maybe trucking, or you may have different parts of the economy that are connected to the old economy, and you have a political leader saying, how do I transition to a new economy? How do you think we can manage that transition in a way that is just?
So if you get it right, then in fact it's a job story and it's a skill story, and I totally agree, it's a place-based development story. But it can't be just imposed from the top. It has to be co-created, gain the confidence, whatever is appropriate, from deep consultation through to indeed co-planning and development, that makes sure that the trust is there, that people see the benefits. Coal mining is at the difficult end because, of course, we have to replace those industries. But if you think about young workers, then they might well be energy workers, but as long as the jobs are good jobs and they're not simply exploitative, which has been some of the big debate, then in fact renewable jobs, or jobs in renewable energy, in green hydrogen, in other areas of a clean economy, are going to be very good jobs. But they have to be indeed jobs that are created with a secure economic base, and community workers and their families and their communities have to have a confidence that they know what the plan is. But I can tell you, the job story is not a bleak one. If you've got 20 jobs in renewable energy, you're going to have 5 to 10 in manufacturing. If they're good jobs, then in transport and logistics and services and other areas of community development, you'll have 30 to 35 additional jobs. That's how you build communities. So we've got the technology. I totally agree with the book. We've got the new technologies will come along, but right now we can make the transition. We do have the finance. We have to think about how to deploy that finance differently, how to work with patient debt and patient capital, because much of the infrastructure costs an extraordinary amount of money up front for a period of time where there won't be a return. But at its heart, just transition is about involving people and asking them what they want. And you will find they want secure jobs for themselves and their children. They want safe communities, and they want an opportunity to actually build their own future, knowing that, the enabling environment is there.
Yeah, you're really echoing, I think, that first point of the book, which is the narrative point, the vision, that political leaders can't just talk about, say, a fuel subsidy or a shift away from coal in a silo. They have to talk about it as part of a larger vision for the country and the economy and all of the many benefits that it's going to provide. Otherwise, you're just making people think they're losing something in a very narrow group that might have a lot of political power. I don't know, but I want to bring you into the conversation too, because you're seeing this again. You focus a lot in Asia. You're seeing this in many geographies in the region. Do you think do you kind of agree with the thesis of the book? I mean, the thesis is essentially the technology is there, the tools, the policies, the finance is there, and the thing holding us back is basically political economy. Like, that's the thing that's stopping us. Is that essentially how you see it when you look at it from your perspective?
Very much so. In fact, first of all, congratulations, Stefan, on bringing out the book at a very opportune time, just weeks before we take stock of where the planet is. I would even suggest, tongue-in-cheek, that perhaps the book should have been written a few years ago, because I think the thesis was relevant.
We tried, I promise.
Well, better late than never, Stefan. Well done. But, I think that this thesis that the technology is there to some extent, somewhere out there in ether, the finance is also there. But what is often not happening is that we are not, what do we mean by the political economy? It's not just about putting politics before the economy. It's about understanding how the economy and economic transformation impacts politics. And I want to just illustrate this with sort of three hypotheses that we can then test out. System change, in my opinion, happens when one of three conditions hold. One, there is crisis. And, many of us living in developing countries endure crises of various kinds from time to time. Most recently, the whole world has gone through the pandemic. So crisis focuses our attention. But crises also tend to be short-lived. And then we move on and we forget. A second driver often, which shapes the political economy, is external pressure. Right? Sometimes emanating from a crisis, sometimes emanating from negotiation. Excuse me. And this, again, results in some change, but not always, because there is that resistance, what Sharon was saying earlier, that then seems to be top-down. So really, the only sustainable way to make sustainability politically sustainable is what I call when the interests of the elite and the interests of the vulnerable converge. And this is where I think there is an opportunity where we look at developing countries and emerging economies. There is an opportunity that emerges in two ways. One, these are the geographies where new infrastructure is going to be built. Right. 88% of our electricity demand, new growth in electricity demand, will come from these economies, which means that you are actually adding to something rather than just substituting coal versus renewables versus oil, etc.
Right. It's not a London household throwing out their oil boiler to put in a solar panel. These are often households that have never had access to electricity.
Exactly. So you're able to converge the need for energy access in the first place with the need to make sure that that energy is clean. And the second driver is, I call it, bringing the energy transition closer to people. So this is not just about the good jobs that Sharon was referring to, but also the good entrepreneurship that can emerge. We estimate, for instance, in rural India alone, the use of distributed renewables to drive livelihood activities is a $50 billion opportunity. Now, that's a humongous fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, but that's not an energy story. It's actually a rural development story. It's a farmer story. It's a food processing story. It's a milk chilling story. It's
is that related to something fundamental about the technology transformation we're talking about? In other words, that the fossil fuel industry was very much kind of a centralized industry. You would produce oil and gas, you would refine it somewhere, then you'd have to, ship it, and truck it all over the country. Whereas now you can distribute, let's say, solar panels and do, renewable grids, microgrids. You can do them all over in rural areas. People can generate their own power. Is it something about the technology that is actually going to unlock more development at the community level?
It's actually never about the technology. It's always about the application of technology. Right? We all have smartphones, or at least many of us do. But it is the convergence of smartphones with digital inclusion that has resulted in financial inclusion for hundreds of millions of people in a place like India, for instance. The smartphone always existed. It's what you use it for, right? And the same applies to a solar panel. Solar panel has been there since we sent a satellite up into space 60 years ago. But when you use a solar panel to chill milk so that a smallholder dairy farmer does not lose their output before the milk gets to the market, that is a transformation of livelihoods, not a transformation of the technology. And this really has to be, back to Stefan's point, the opening salvo of that narrative. How are we leveraging the energy transition for an economic transformation that is just.
Stefan, it's very easy for people in your profession, economists, to say, hey, let's just have a carbon tax. And I guess in some places that has worked, right? I mean, it sounds like a very simple tool, and it can work. What we're hearing now sounds a bit more complex about getting to the community level, understanding their needs, this bottom-up approach. What would you say to people who are, eager to see the world make a transition here? They say this is urgent, there's no time to waste, and we know it works. Let's just do a carbon tax.
Well, so I think there are two dimensions here. First, we know that a carbon tax, one instrument alone, will never cut it, right? You need also to invest in the right infrastructure. You need the right governance of your energy systems. It's really like a package of things that needs to be done in parallel. But there is also this question, and the book looks a lot at the sequencing of things. Because if you look at what China did, for instance, they are creating an emission trading system now, but they did not start with that. They started by subsidizing and supporting the creation of a renewable energy industry. It reduced costs. It also created people supporting more action on climate. And then slowly you can see the creation of the emission trading system and then the tightening of it. But it's a process over more than 1 decade. In the book, we review the carbon tax in Canada. And again, it's a package of policy, well designed, but it's also not something that falls out of blue sky, right? You have to prepare. And we propose a tool in the book for every country to identify what is feasible now, but also what it is that I can do to create momentum, create supportive coalitions, create consensus, and then think about not only what I can do over the short run, but also how do I build a transformation over a few decades, because that's the challenge. We have to be fast, but we also have to do things which are sustainable, predictable, and will take place over many decades. So it cannot change at every election. You need to engage with your opponents, to engage with the society at large, to make sure you have a clear direction of travel so that people can invest and make decisions based on this direction of travel.
Yeah, we had this session at the World Bank annual meetings I mentioned on critical minerals. The minister for finance of Zambia was there, and he was talking about how Zambia is still producing the same amount of copper today as they did in the 70s. And that it is you need these long-term policy changes to incent investors, right? And we talked earlier a little bit about how the finance is sort of there. In a way it is. There's all this private sector financing on the sidelines, ready to invest in a green transition. But it's not going to simply come without a long-term predictable policy environment of the kind you talked about in China, where they had a very long-term vision for how they were going to green that economy. I guess, Sharon, it seems like there's the danger that something like the COP, institutions like the World Bank, that we can be very top-down. And you're saying that's actually not the way to do it. How do you ensure this becomes more of a movement? I mean, this is something you've spent your career working on in the labor movement. How do you ensure this is not something that is imposed, but actually is a global movement at the grassroots level?
Well, you need both. You need national policy, without doubt. But there's so much that business and workers can do if they, in fact, work together and embrace the development opportunities that are possible with a shift in the energy mix. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with a carbon tax. That would solve a whole lot of market-based problems. But in its own, Stefan is right. It's not. It's one tool. But we need to make sure that, indeed, where you're talking about critical minerals, for example, if you're going to simply supply more critical minerals on the same current exploitative supply chains, what you're actually allowing companies to do is to perpetuate child labor, forced labor, horrible conditions. Whereas if we build a critical minerals industry on not just a clean technology base, which is absolutely magic for place-based development in many parts of the world. And in fact, I'm here in Western Australia, in the Australian continent, and it has all of those critical minerals, but they need to be, in fact, developed, because traditionally they've been dug up, sent off overseas. But when you're looking at upstream and downstream supply chains, then you've got the kind of economic development possibilities that we've only ever dreamed about in the past. But it has to be an integrated strategy. It has to have, of course, federal and state governments, all subnational governments, cities, everybody working to actually inform the models. But you need the people at the centre. If you don't put people and planet at the heart of this phase of economic development, then we're just going to fail. It's that simple.
Right.
In fact, on the finance front, can I tell you that you risk, Systemic has a figure that says you risk $100 billion of climate finance every year if the consultation and the commitment from people is not there.
Right, because in the end, you need people to come along, right? And you need to see that investors need to see that this is a sustainable long-term investment. It sounds like, well, we're talking about kind of the glass half full. We're saying, look, there are real opportunities, which I'm glad we're saying. Buried in your comment, Sharon, is the fact that there's also a real risk, right? That you will see countries, we talked about China's transition, you'll see countries move ahead with the energy transition, which is going to require tremendous amounts of critical minerals. And we could simply expand an unjust and exploitative industry. And so you could end up with exactly the kind of issues we have today of tremendous inequality and poverty, and maybe even worse climate results in a lot of places, right? Because these are very energy intensive industries. If we don't think about this as one global strategy that many countries have to connect into. It's hard for Australia's maybe an example where you have a bit of everything. You've got sun and you've got minerals and you've got workforce, right? But not everywhere has that. A lot of countries are going to need to be part of a broader system and trade. And so it seems like there is some risk here, right? If we don't move in the direction that Stefan and this book are arguing for, if we don't take the lessons of political economy sooner rather than later, we could see countries kind of going in the wrong direction.
Well, precisely. But the one thing I was going to say to Stefan is that if we are going to do exactly what you've just said, Raj, and that is, bring everybody along on this wave and not leave stranded people and stranded communities as well as stranded assets, then we also need to think about how we share our technological knowledge. I mean, we all saw vaccine nationalism and the ugliness of it during the pandemic. I don't think any of us could have imagined that level of greed and imposition to delivering life-saving vaccinations and the knowledge about how to produce them to countries everywhere. But we'll do the same with the energy technology or other clean economy technologies if we don't share it. So we need to look at our IP model. I've always been a fan of technology pools or an IP bank. But if we don't have thinkers like the World Bank, the IMF, other global institutions, absolutely working on how we acknowledge entrepreneurial, value creation, but at the same time, how we share it.
I've heard this argument brought up in the past, Sharon. I just maybe dig a little bit deeper. Is it specific in the solar sector? Is that where we're particularly worried that countries are going to end up just importing solar panels and inverters and batteries? Or do you think this is a broader issue? And how critical is it? Like, is this the thing when Stefan is talking about unlocking the political economy? Is this one of those top tier issues?
Yeah, but it isn't just solar panels. I would argue it's new industrial technologies. And indeed, we're talking about how you engage people. One of the things that the Curtin University here has done is build teams with, energy humanity disciplines in them, or, climate humanity experts, because if you're not actually pulling people together across the knowledge, the implementation, the technical skills, and the community skills, then we're going to fail. So I would simply say you cannot have a world where technology that is so vital to save our planet, to stabilize the planet for humanity, is actually locked up in wealth creation for those who are already wealthiest. We have to find a way to share that technology and to create cooperative development, place-based development, not competitive development, or we will fail. No question about that.
Stefan, what's your take on this issue?
No, I mean, I think I agree, and we see at this point in time both this rush toward green technologies, and you mentioned solar, but in batteries it might be even stronger. We see in green hydrogen, all countries are trying to become leading, or at least to have the control of those technologies and not to depend on others. And of course, it takes place in the geopolitical context that we know of. And I think this is really a critical question, because it's a good thing that we have this race and those investments. It could also very easily work against, especially the poorest countries. And thinking about how countries in Africa, for instance, can be connected to this green global value chain beyond just exporting commodities, because there are not many jobs in exporting commodities. So what you really want is those countries to be able to go downstream in the use of those commodities to export more and more developed products, because that's where development lies. And at the moment, the competition against the big players don't leave a lot of space for those countries to do that. And last point, we're talking a lot about energy here, but we have been working a lot on the Amazon or in the Congo basin. We can make exactly the same point on forestry.
Yeah.
You can protect the forest by just enforcing no deforestation rules. But if you don't create jobs and activities to replace that, we have seen this backfire very, very strongly in those places. People are saying, this is my livelihood. You cannot take it away from me unless I have the infrastructure, the energy, and basically the economic environment I need to do something else in services, in manufacturing, in agriculture. It cannot be just stopping deforestation. It needs to be in this creation of new activities. And technologies in agriculture will play a key role for that. We need also better technologies for agriculture.
Anurag, how are you seeing this in the context of India? How is the country doing in terms of this transition? Because in a country that large, it's so impactful to the global goals on climate and to the global economy. You have these interests, but they're spread out. It's a very complex puzzle. How is the adaptation, the transition happening in India? Is it on the right track?
Well, in some ways, it's more than on the right track. It's racing ahead because, in 2010, for instance, when I set up a CEW, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. We now have nearly 70,000 megawatts of solar, 185,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity, and have an ambition of building 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030, which basically means this 1 hour we have this conversation, India would have built another 11 to 12 megawatts of renewables. So that is a pace of change that is not seen in many other places. Already now, the 4th largest renewable energy market in the world by deployed capacity. But on the back of this is really some of the things that Sharon brought up in her original answer, and I want to draw some connection to that. It is, what is the nature of this development? So one of the things is that we see a lot more opportunity to converge not just the sustainability, but with the jobs and the growth. We see a lot more opportunity arising in the distributed energy sector. So we estimate that about 50 million jobs could be created overall through our transition in the course of this decade. But a bulk of them, about 80% of those, would be in distributed energy, in rooftop energy, etc. So that is what democratizes this energy transition, rather than building solar panels far out in the desert somewhere and then stringing the wire all across. That's one thing. The second thing that's happening is we're looking at how does this impact the broader supply chain, which is where now the focus on manufacturing is coming in. And this conversation that both Sharon and Stefan were having with you is important. Globally, we have seen a increasing concentration of clean energy technology manufacturing than the opposite over the last decade. The number of countries that had concentrated imports of solar technologies was 38 in 2012. That's jumped to 71 in 2021. Concentrated imports of lithium-ion batteries, 19 in 2012, jumped to 49 in 2021. 73% of clean tech IPRs rest in 5 countries alone. Now, unless we figure out a globally coordinated approach towards democratizing the access to the technology, but even more, the co-development of the future technologies, we will get this pushback. So I think back to this political economy question, if the first stage of opposition was sort of intersectoral but intra-country challenges, the second stage that we're entering now is going to be inter-country problems. We'll have a beggar thy neighbor policy, and we'll have a beggar thy labor policy, where countries will start saying, I'm going to pump in hundreds of billions of dollars from my economy. I don't really care what happens to you. That is not a recipe either for success on the sustainability front or on the energy security and sustainability.
I don't know, but just to make this a finer point, is this basically China and the U.S.? I mean, is this, Stefan referred earlier to China having this long-term subsidy program to build their renewable energy industry very successfully, but in some ways that has made the cost of their products, whether it's panels or electric vehicles, so low that they can compete in other countries and maybe are hurting domestic production of those industries. And then now the U.S. with the IRA has come forward and said, we're going to subsidize in a big way the U.S. renewable energy industry. Is it really just about these two countries essentially, or do you feel like this is a broader issue?
No, I mean, Stefan talked about, it is very much, at least on the solar side, is very much a China story. In the critical minerals and battery side, very much a China story. But if you look at green hydrogen, the lowest cost production of green hydrogen will be within the tropics. But if the US is going to give $3 of subsidies on a $4 cost for green hydrogen, it's never going to get produced within the tropics. And that's actually a suboptimal way of going towards sustainability, basically banking on how long you can, keep the U.S. Congress agreeing to, give this level of subsidy year on year. Now, what if the politics changes and you drop that subsidy? You will have a slowdown then in the US, but at the same time, you've not built up the infrastructure where the sun shines the most and the hydrogen can be generated at the lowest cost. So it is actually even in the interest of the US to find a way of having an interdependent global ecosystem on clean tech. It's in the interest of China as well. It's in the interest of the European Union as well. So it's not just a question of Namibia saying, how can I be a player in the green hydrogen story? It's not just a question of DRC saying, how can I add some value to the critical minerals that are being drawn up? It is in our strategic interest to develop those interdependent relationships, which then create a market that is more sustainable and actually more economically efficient.
So we started this conversation by saying political economy is the key. And now we're saying it's also geopolitical economy that's the key, right? Because this is about how countries are going to work together as we make a major global transition to a new economy. And obviously it points right back to the World Bank and its new reform, its new leadership, and its new mission. Because in the end, financing is a big part of this, right? The ability to use the financial leverage of the bank to develop exactly the kind of markets you're talking about. And we've had a number of questions come in from people following us along, and many of them have already been about finance. I encourage people to keep adding questions if they want to get them answered. But maybe we can just talk about this point about finance and the role of the World Bank in particular, because it seems like a lot of what we're talking about here is finance. It's China using their financial resources to subsidize their industries. The U.S., using its massive fiscal space to subsidize an entire industry. Not every country has that fiscal space. In fact, post-COVID, most have a very diminished fiscal space. What can the World Bank, other institutions like it do on the financing side? And I open this up to any of you who want to jump in.
I would be very curious to hear my co-panelist on this. If I can just say one thing, I think you started with this change in the vision, which is symbolic but really important, because that's our commitment to bring nature, climate, the environment at the core of development, not because it's nice, but because we think that this is the only way to reduce poverty for good, right? If you want this poverty eradication not only to happen, but to be sustainable over time, it needs to be done on a livable planet. And to give you one example of how this affects our daily operations, we used to have 3 core diagnostics to guide our portfolio and our lending. One on economic growth, one on poverty, and one on public finance. Now we have a 4th one, the country climate and development reports, which we're doing in all countries. We'll have the 41st published before COP. And we're looking at all of the opportunities to align development and climate. And we use that to decide of our own portfolio, to help inform debates in countries, to help countries make their own decisions and choices. And we see more and more people starting to use this analytics to just guide their own decisions. This is really now part of the core diagnostics that we use to prioritize. And this is a really big change. And of course, it won't happen without big changes in countries' own policies and action. But from the World Bank side, we really want to make that part of the support that we provide to all countries.
So can I just say the biggest problem you've got with finance is in fact debt. We are now in a world where our current model of economy has failed both people and the planet, and it's left developing and even emerging economies with such a level of debt that when you think that you're going to be asked to spend, you know, trillions on infrastructure for mitigation or adaptation, I think those things are often interrelated, but, you know, whatever it is, if we don't work out a way of dealing with debt that has a more patient approach to actually learning the lessons of short-termism and looking to patient capital, thinking about how we do de-risk for developing countries and emerging economies, the critical first phase, which could be, I don't know, Aranubi, you're the expert, but 10, 15 years of critical infrastructure in things like green hydrogen and, you know, getting production and manufacturing up to speed, again, comes back to whether or not you can afford or you can share the technology. But debt has to be tackled, and we have to take a deep look. There's a reality for developing economies, particularly, that they can't borrow money like Western countries can. It costs 4 to 6, 7, 8 times more to borrow money. But when a country is paying more in debt repayments than it pays in its health and education and, you know, critical services areas of public finances, then how on earth do we actually stabilize the planet? Again, it comes back to exactly what Aranuba said, which is where's the interdependence and the co-responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great point, Sharon. And how do you get that social contract to work? Because as Stefan brought up right at the beginning, trust is so key to this. And so if the public, if communities see, well, my government doesn't have much, and in fact, it's diminishing resources to pay for health services or education services or infrastructure, it's much harder to create the trust required for this much larger vision that we're all here presenting. Arnav, what are your thoughts on this topic?
I agree with both what Stefan and Sharon said. I'd like to keep a simple formula in my mind. Finance has to be cheap, long, and convenient. I'm going to hold the World Bank account on these 3 points. How do you make it cheap? To Sharon's point about debt, why is debt expensive? Yes, we are developing countries. There are some risks, but the risk that the market perceives is far higher than the risk that they actually encounter. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a finance roundtable here in New Delhi. One financial institution said they had made 350 investments, debt-related investments in India. Only one turned out to be a non-performing asset, right? I don't
know, but that creates a big opportunity for the World Bank's MIGA in particular, because you can insure a lot of this debt and reduce the costs dramatically without taking on much risk if that risk is mostly perceived.
Reduce the information asymmetry in the first place, and get everyone to understand that developing countries are developing, but they are not as crazily risky as we expect them to be. And the second thing is, again, we got to make finance long. That doesn't mean an individual investor will stick around for 25 years. But how does the bank come in to help deepen financial markets so that there is the refinancing of the loan? So I exit after 7 years of investment, but someone else is there to take it on and take it to the next 7 years. And in the next 7 years, till you get a 25-year investment for a green.
I was just with Mia Mottley, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, who's of course been a big leader on these issues at the Paris Peace Forum a week ago. And I was interviewing her on stage, and she was talking about how the debt from the reconstruction of World War I and World War II in the UK and Germany was just paid off, 7 or 8 years ago, because it has been refinanced for 100 years. To your point and to Sharon's about the long-term nature of debt that's required, that's one way to address the debt problem, is to be able to stretch it out at the time scale of something like an energy transition.
Indeed. And beyond that, really, when it comes back to people and planet, to use Sharon's phrase, you've got to make finance convenient. Do you really believe that, the bulk of the small, medium enterprises that, make up the industrial structure of most developing countries will have the ability to absorb the transaction and the administrative costs of applying for grants from the Green Climate Fund? The answer is no, because we've not made it convenient for them to access finance, even if they were able to afford it. So the World Bank reform, which is now underway, is extremely welcome, but really the metric we need to use in every new programming is, did it make the loans cheaper? Or did it make the loans longer? Or did it make it easier to access capital? If it is not one or the above three, ideally all three, then we've not reformed enough.
It's a great point. We had a story yesterday at DevX about exactly this, talking to local organizations looking for funding from the Green Climate Fund, and finding it really challenging to just be able to navigate the process. And of course, you understand the other side of it. Institutions like GFC, the World Bank, and others, they have long been governed from a risk aversion perspective with lots of compliance, and their shareholders and stakeholders have wanted and put in place all of this bureaucracy for a reason. So getting through it is not so straightforward, but it's a key point that you're raising. We're getting toward the end of our session, and I thought we could maybe end, Stefan, and all of you, with a question that we got really about where have we seen successes. You've got more examples, I know, from the book you can share, Stefan, and then maybe Sharon and Arnab, maybe you have some more as well, in particular where communities have been engaged and it's actually worked. So Stefan, let me begin with you.
So that's a great way of finishing. Just saying, I think Arnab made very, very important points on the fact that when we talk about the global financing architecture, we have to understand how those resources end up to the people who need to spend it. The small companies investing in a different border, the communities in forests trying to start agroforestry. It's not only an international problem. You need the plumbing in countries to go to the people who need to spend it. In terms of example, I could have hundreds, right? But just maybe two things. Kenya or Burkina Faso reform their energy markets to make it more attractive for external investors. And you see immediately the change. You have private resources coming in, and you have a shift toward renewables because that's the cheapest if you have cheap finance available. And the country did not have to spend more. It's just a change in how they regulate their energy markets. And I think we're often talking about the need to invest more. I think it's really, really important. We have not to forget that countries can also spend better with the resources they have. And it's part of the equation. We're looking quite a lot at subsidy reforms because, $1.2 trillion are invested in those subsidies. We're not saying that it should be removed from people. We're saying if those subsidies are designed differently, they can favor green and sustainable solutions instead of overuse of fossil fuels, overuse of fertilizers, and so on. And so we should not only look at how we could spend more, but we should also look at what is spent now. And the book provides really like a guidebook on how you can make sure you keep helping people, you keep reducing poverty, but in a way that is also preserving the long-term livable planet.
It's an important point, and it connects so well to Sharon's earlier point about debt and this huge challenge we have around debt, because if countries see this only as something where we have to take on more debt, but they may be slow to move. But you're saying actually there's some policy reforms that don't cost more but bring in external finance, and it's worth considering how to repurpose existing subsidies within this challenged fiscal environment. Sharon, what about you? Are there places you've seen success stories that give you some hope about where we go from here?
Well, definitely, but I'm also very, very supportive of repurposing fossil fuel subsidies and other harmful environmental subsidies. You don't take them away, you say use them or lose them. You either transition or you don't. But I also think that some of the great successes are actually at the community level, where people have taken on a particular, challenge, have built productive wealth. I mean, Aranuba can tell you about, informal stories in India, like our Self-Employed Women's Association, who has helped whole communities actually get energy. Women get solar energy rather than diesel pumps for livelihoods like salt mining, but also community endeavours and the like. In countries like Spain, where you have, in my view, one of the world's great environment ministers, now deputy president, well, in transition, of course, but Teresa Rivera, the coal mining transition was done much better than in most other places. In Sweden, where you've moved from working with the unions, the company SSAB Steel now produces green steel with green hydrogen. There are more jobs because of the hydrogen injection. Reskilling was essential. And now place-based development in some of the, they don't have a lot of mines in terms of ore, but where there are, the development alongside each other that we can learn from in terms of protecting and building communities. I could talk to you about transition stories all day, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I can tell you, if you don't actually engage with the community, then we are not going to make the pace and the scale that we need to simply stabilise the planet. Just even right here tomorrow, we will look at how you go to, within 10 years, to 70% renewable energy. That's 30 times the growth story. And if you think about that, just the planning in that alone, but also the integrated industrial development. And industry policy is back on the deck, and it's good for workers, good for community. But I agree with Aranuba. If we just have a competitive base about, my economy and bigger than neighbour, then that's not going to help the world stabilise in the geopolitical terms as well as climate terms you talked about, Raj.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And Arnaldo, you get the last word here. In very brief form, in just a minute or so, are there examples you're seeing as well where you think we have some sense of hope we can copy, we can move forward in that direction? You're muted.
Muted. I think Stefan and Sharon have given some great examples. I've already described how in India, our energy access story from 2015, when we had the largest number of people without access to electricity, to now getting electricity to over 98% of the households, while at the same time building the 4th largest renewable energy market, demonstrates that there's not one energy transition, but multiple ones that can happen, not sequentially, but simultaneously. But I here in the chat window, I've just put a link to a compendium of distributed renewable energy case studies, 27 of them from 22 countries, from across the world, that we did as an official report for the G20, demonstrating how you can bring people and planet together. So I think it's not the question of just, can we spend more time coming up with more and more stories? It goes back to Stefan's first message. The narrative itself now needs to fundamentally change. We're not talking about sustainability at the margin, but it is the mainstream. And the mainstream only becomes sustainable politically if you bring it closer to the people.
It's a fantastic point, and it's amazing how all three of you have really underlined that same theme. And the book, which gets into it in great detail, is something I'd really recommend to all of you to look at. It's called Within Reach: Navigating the Political Economy of Decarbonization. It's published by the World Bank. It's out today. This has been a session in partnership with the World Bank. We really appreciate the partnership we have with you. And it's hard to believe just 2 weeks from now, we will be at COP in Dubai. People will be there in person by the tens of thousands, and millions around the world will be focused on what's happening there because it's so critical. So this book, this point that all of you are making, that this is a moment in time we have to capture and take advantage of, I think is so critical. And I thank all of you. I thank everyone who's followed this conversation live or watching the recording for being a part of it. Arnaba Ghosh, Sharon Burrow, Stefan Halaget. It's great to have the three of you here, and my thanks to everyone who's part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all participants.